The cold hit her before the ground did. Neva didn't remember falling. One moment she was standing in the narrow gap between two freight cars, watching the black pines blur past in the October dark. And the next she was face down in the gravel beside the tracks. With blood in her mouth and the sound of the train already fading into the mountains, she lay there for a long time, long enough for the sound to disappear entirely, long enough for the cold to work its way through her coat and settle against her ribs like something alive. When she finally pushed herself upright, there was nothing around her but trees and the last grey strip of sky above the cut in the mountain. The tracks ran east and west. East was where she'd come from. West was where she'd been going. Edmonton, then wherever came after that, anywhere that wasn't the apartment above her ex-husband's sister's dress shop in Sudbury, Ontario, where she'd been sleeping on a folding cot and pretending she wasn't broken. The train was gone. Her bag was on it. She stood up. Her left knee screamed at her. She ignored it and looked west, then east, then up at the sky, where the light was dying fast, and she understood that only Cunley comes when there's no one else to help you understand. That she was alone in the Rockies with nothing but the clothes on her back and a quarter tank of stubbornness. She started walking west. She'd been on the train for 2 days. The story she'd told herself was that she was going to start over. She was 31 years old. She'd given 7 years to a marriage that turned out to be mostly performance, and she still had her nursing certificate and 2 references, and a name that nobody in Alberta would recognize. The story was almost believable. She'd told it to herself through Winnipeg and Swift Current and Medicine Hat, watching the landscape flatten, and then, past Calgary, begin to buckle upward into something enormous and indifferent. She hadn't been pushed. She needed to be clear about that, even if there was no one to be clear with. She'd been standing at the end of the car, trying to get some air, because the heating had broken somewhere past Banff, and the car had swung the other direction into Stuffy, and she'd been leaning out looking at the mountains when the coupling shifted, some mechanical complaint she didn't understand. And her grip had slipped, and that was all. No villain, no conspiracy, just bad luck and a loose handle, and the particular way the world sometimes let go of you without warning. She walked west until she couldn't see her feet anymore, and then she stopped walking because the alternative was falling again, and once was enough. She pressed herself against the cut bank and listened. Wind. Somewhere water moving fast over rock, and then, far up the slope to the north, the faint amber stain of a light between the trees. The man who opened the door was not small. He filled the frame the way a door should be filled. Not aggressively, just completely, the way a draft horse fills a stall. He was holding a lantern, and he was looking at her the way you look at something that doesn't belong where you found it, she said. I fell off the train. He looked past her at the dark, then back at her. Your face is bleeding, he said. I know. He held the lantern a little higher. He had dark hair, a beard that had been left to its own opinions, and eyes that were a particular shade of pale that made them look lit from the inside. He was maybe 40, maybe younger, and just weathered. She couldn't tell. How far back, he said. I don't know. I walked maybe 2 hours. He studied her face for another moment, not unkindly, exactly, but not warmly either, more the way you study a problem. Come in, he said, and stood aside. His name was Cotter. He didn't offer a last name, and she didn't ask. The cabin was one room with a loft. It was warmer than the outside, and smelled of wood smoke and pine pitch and something that might have been rendered fat. There was a cook stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, shelves along one wall, crowded with jars and tools and folded canvas. A rifle hung above the door, snowshoes hung beside it. He pointed her at the chair closest to the stove. He didn't say anything while he put a pot of water on. He came back with a cloth that was clean if not new, and he set it on the table in front of her without comment. She pressed it against her forehead. The cut wasn't deep. Head wounds bled like they meant it regardless. "You live up here alone?" she said. "Yes. How far are we from the rail line?" "Far enough that you didn't walk it in the dark with a hurt knee." She hadn't mentioned the knee. She looked at him. "You're walking with it turned out," he said. "Sit straight, and it'll swell less." She sat straight. He poured water into a basin and set it on the table. He didn't offer to clean the cut himself. He put the cloth and the basin in front of her and stepped back, and that was that. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated the alternative. "There's a train station," she said. "West. How far?" "Day and a half on horseback." He paused. 3 days walking in good weather." She looked at the window. The darkness outside had turned to weather. She could hear it now, the particular high moan of wind coming off elevation. "It's not good weather," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." The storm kept her for 4 days. She learned his name was Cotter, and that he'd been on this mountain for 11 years, and that he trapped and he guided, occasionally, parties of men who came up from Calgary wanting to feel like they'd done something difficult. He told her this in pieces, over meals, the way a man tells you things when he's forgotten how to have a conversation, but remembers the general shape of one. He was not cruel. She'd half expected cruelty, some hardscrabble isolation meanness, but what she found instead was a person who had arranged his life with very precise economy, and found her presence a disruption he was managing with deliberate care. He gave her the loft. He slept below. He knocked before coming up the ladder, which she found unexpectedly touching, given that it was his house. On the second day, because she couldn't stand sitting still, she asked if there was something she could do. He looked at her for a moment. "You know how to cook?" "Yes." "Cook, then." It was not a gracious offer. She accepted it anyway and rooted through his shelves and made a bean soup with dried venison that was better than she'd expected from what was available. He ate 2 bowls of it without comment. She counted that a victory. On the third day he showed her how to keep the stove going through the night without wasting wood. Damper position. How to read the drawer. How to stack so the coals held longest. He explained it the same way he'd explained how to clean the cut on her head. Efficiently, without softening, with the assumption that she was capable of understanding. Nobody had assumed she was capable of much in quite some time. She didn't say that. She just listened and did what he showed her. That evening, the wind dropped enough that she could hear the creek again, and she sat by the window for a while, watching the snow sift down through the pines. And she thought about Edmonton and the nursing job, and the folding cot in Sudbury. And she thought about the train pulling west without her. She was surprised to find she didn't feel as desperate about it as she had 2 days ago. The panic had quieted. She didn't entirely trust that. On the 4th day, the storm broke. Cotter went out early to check the traps. He came back with 2 hares and a marten, and something in his expression that was harder to read than usual. "There's a problem," he said. He set the animals on the table and sat down across from her. His hands were very still. "I've got a supply run due," he said. "Jasper, I take the horse and I'm gone 4 days, maybe 5 if the pass is drifted. I go now or I wait another 2 weeks and start running short on things I can't do without." "All right," she said. "You can come, or—" He looked at the table. "Or you stay. The cabin's stocked enough, stove's simple. I showed you the wood." She understood what he was offering. Not just shelter, the choice. He wasn't deciding for her, which was more than most people had done lately. "I'll stay," she said. He nodded once. He didn't ask her why. She didn't explain. She wasn't entirely sure she could have. The 4 days alone were the strangest and most clarifying of her adult life. She had been lonely in Sudbury in a way that had company in it, which is a particular kind of loneliness that wears you down. She had been lonely in her marriage for the last 2 years of it, which is the loneliest kind there is. But alone in the cabin, on the mountain, with the stove and the creek, and the particular quality of silence that snow produces, she found something that wasn't exactly peace, but was adjacent to it. She kept busy. She found a split seam in his spare coat, and mended it, badly at first, and then well enough, tearing out the first attempt, when she found a proper needle in the tin on the shelf. She split wood, which she'd never done before. She was terrible at it, for most of the first day, and then her grip shifted on the axe handle, and something clicked into place, and she got through most of a cord before her shoulders gave out. She found a bucket of oats and fed the mule he'd left in the small barn, and scratched its ugly grey head, and talked to it for an embarrassingly long time. She thought about her mother, who had grown up on a farm outside of Trois-Rivières, and who had talked about that life the way people talk about something they're still grieving. She'd always thought she understood. She was starting to think she'd understood nothing at all. On the third evening, a bull elk came out of the tree line and stood in the clearing in front of the cabin for a long time, looking at the light in the window. She watched it from the glass. It was the largest animal she'd ever seen outside a zoo. It made the clearing look small. She held her breath until it stepped back into the dark. She wrote it down in a small notebook she'd found under the loft stairs. Cotter's. She was fairly sure, though it was nearly empty. She wrote down the elk and the snow and what the creek sounded like in the morning, when everything else was still. She wrote because she wanted to remember it properly, not the softened and tidied version memory tends to produce. She wanted the real version. The cold and the ache in her shoulders and the smell of the wood smoke in her hair. He came back on the afternoon of the fourth day. She heard the horse on the path before she saw him, and she went to the window and watched him come out of the trees with the horse loaded and snow on his shoulders, and the particular deliberate way he moved that she'd started to recognize. He looked up at the cabin window and she stepped back. Not sure why. She put the kettle on. He came in with his arms full and set supplies on the table and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked around the cabin. The mended coat on its hook, the stacked wood inside the door, the clean pot on the stove. "You split the birch," he said. "Most of it." He set down the sack he was still holding. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her that first night on the doorstep, but differently, like the problem had rearranged itself into something he didn't have a previous answer for. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. "I know." He nodded. He went to the stove and poured himself some of the tea she'd made and stood at the window and drank it. She sat at the table and didn't say anything. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It had a different quality than the silences she'd known. Not empty, but full of something that hadn't decided what it was yet. "Nurse," he finally said. She looked up. He was still looking out the window. "You said you're a nurse. I have the certificate. I've got a boy in Jasper." He said it the same way he said everything. Flat, no performance. "My sister's raising him. He's 6. He gets chest colds that go bad." She waited. "If you stayed," he said, "through winter, that's something that would be useful," she almost said. "I'm not a bargaining chip." She swallowed it because she could hear that wasn't what he meant. He was telling her the practical reason because he didn't know another way to say it. "I'd want to go to Jasper," she said. "See him. I take a run every 6 weeks. I'd need my own corner, not the loft. Something with a door." He turned from the window. "I can put a wall up." She hadn't expected that, the speed of it, or the certainty. "By when?" she said. "End of the week." She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Edmonton, the job posting she'd answered on a bulletin board in a laundromat. A furnished room, possible. A salary that was possible. A whole chain of possible that depended on stepping off a train at the right station. She had stepped off a train, admittedly in the wrong place and without using the stairs. "All right," she said. He nodded. He turned back to the window. "The elk was here," she said. "Wednesday evening, big one." He was quiet for a moment. "That's Morton," he said. She blinked. "You named the elk." "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been, in a person who had more practice with it, a kind of dry amusement. "The boys from the outfitter named him. I just use it." She looked at the window. Outside the light was going the particular amber rose It went in the mountains when the sun hit the snowfields on the peaks and threw the light back sideways. She'd never seen light that color before this week. "All right," she said again. "I'll stay through winter." The wall went up in 4 days. Rough lumber, a real door with a proper latch, a window that faced east so the morning light came in first. He didn't ask her how she wanted it. He built it the way he built everything, with complete attention and without waste. And when it was done, she stood in the doorway of the small room and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was that a space belonged to her. She wrote that down too. November came, and with it the particular rigor of a Rocky Mountain winter that is different in kind from the cold she'd grown up with in northern Ontario. She knew cold. She did not know this cold, which was cleaner and more absolute and had a silence inside it that the city kind never had. She learned things. She learned to read the sky for snow the way Cotter read it. The particular woolly ceiling that meant a system coming, the high, thin cirrus that meant days of cold with no moisture. She learned to check the mule's feet for ice balls. She learned to keep a fire banked through the night without letting it go out, and then to let it go out when the wood needed conserving, and the difference between those moments. She learned that beaver pelts had a grain, and you worked with it. And you worked with it, not against it, and that her hands would crack and bleed in the dry cold no matter how much tallow she rubbed into them, and that this was simply the case, and not a complaint worth making. She went to Jasper in November. The boy's name was Theo, and he had his father's pale eyes, and his father's stillness and a chest that rattled when he breathed hard. She spent 2 days with him, and Cotter's sister, Margit, a small hard-shouldered woman from Medicine Hat, who had opinions about everything, and kept them mostly to herself, which Neva respected. She checked Theo over and told Margit what to watch for and left a list of what to do if the rattle got worse. Margit read the list twice and folded it and put it in her apron pocket without a word. Neva understood she'd be following it, driving back up into the mountains with Cotter on the seat of the supply wagon, the valley falling away behind them. She thought about what she was going back to and didn't find any part of it that frightened her. That surprised her too. He was not an easy person to know. This was different from him being a difficult person. He was not difficult. He was clear. What he meant he said, and what he didn't mean he didn't say. And there was a restfulness in that, after years of a marriage, built on layers of implication and careful performance. But he kept his interior life the way he kept the supply shed, organized and not for general access. She learned him in the way she'd learned the stove and the sky, in practical increments, by paying attention. She learned that he was from Manitoba originally, a town near Brandon, that he mentioned once and never again. She learned that he'd been on the mountain since he was in his late 20s, and that there had been a woman involved in that decision, or the end of one. She pieced this together from 3 separate conversations over the course of 6 weeks, each one a fragment, none of them a story. She didn't ask for the story. She'd had enough of people who turned their past into the whole of who they were. She learned that he checked the traps in a particular order that had to do with the slope and the drainage and the way the animals moved, and that he'd mapped this order in his head the first winter and refined it every year since. She learned that he brought the maps for the parties he guided, but rarely used them. She learned that when something was broken, he fixed it entirely and didn't leave it half done. She learned that he read, slowly, as if reading cost him something, but steadily. There was a crate of books under his bed that she didn't look through until December, and then did carefully, one by one, and put back exactly as she found them. They were an odd collection. Some history, some poetry, a medical manual from the 1890s that she found professionally quaint, and one very battered novel about a man who spent his life building boats that she suspected he'd read more than once. She left her notebook on the table one evening by accident. She came back for it, and it was where she'd left it, closed, and she couldn't tell if he'd read it. She didn't ask. What she'd written wasn't private, exactly, but it wasn't meant for anyone either. It was just the truth of what was happening, kept somewhere outside her head so she could look at it. December brought a storm that lasted 8 days. They were inside together for all of it. She had wondered in October how she would manage the proximity, another person's habits, the small frictions of shared space. What she found was that the cabin was larger than she'd thought, not in square footage, but in the way two people can move around each other when neither one needs to fill the air. She read. She mended. She made a list of supplies Margit had mentioned. She couldn't easily get in Jasper, and worked out whether they could bring them on the next run. She reorganized the medical kit she'd found in the corner and told Cotter what it was missing, and he wrote it down without comment. He carved, sometimes. She hadn't seen this before the storm. He did it when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Small animals from birch scraps, quick and sure. He left them on the shelf, beside the other things there. She didn't say anything about it. On the 6th day she made bread from the sourdough starter she'd found in a crock on the shelf. Real bread, the kind that needed 3 rising periods and attention, the kind her grandmother had made in a farmhouse kitchen, and that Neva had made exactly once in her adult life. It turned out better than she expected. The smell of it changed the quality of the day entirely. Cotter came in from checking the outer door where the wind had been working at a seam, and stood in the middle of the room and breathed in. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I forgot about that." She looked at him. He was looking at the loaf on the board. "About bread," she said. "About what it smells like," he said, "when someone makes it." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. She turned back to the stove and listened to the storm work at the roof, and in her chest something shifted. A small tectonic thing, the kind of movement you can feel but not name, the kind that changes the shape of the ground afterward, whether you want it to or not. January, Theo got a chest cold that Margit sent word about by a man going through to Banff. Cotter saddled the horse in the dark before first light. Neva was ready before him. They rode to Jasper in 2 days, through cold that was 30 below in the valley. She didn't complain about it. He didn't comment on the fact that she didn't. They moved together in the purposeful, wordless way they'd learned over the last months. She took the outer side of the trail where the wind was worse, so he could set the pace on the horse. She had her kit over her shoulder. She knew what she'd find before she got there. Theo was better than the message had made it sound. Margit had handled it well. Neva checked him over and sat with him for an hour. While he told her at length about a book, Margit had been reading to him about a dog that learned to do tricks, and the injustice of various things at school, and a friend called Josef, who had apparently the best sled in Jasper and wasn't sharing it properly. She laughed properly for the first time, in a long time. Cotter was in the doorway. She couldn't see his face from where she was sitting, but she could see that he'd stopped moving, and she knew somehow that he was listening not to what Theo was saying, but to her laughing. That night at Margit's table, Margit said to her, very quietly, while Cotter was outside, "He's not the same as before. "What?" Neva said. Margit looked at her with the particular patience of a woman who doesn't repeat herself. Then she refilled Neva's cup and changed the subject. February. She'd been on the mountain for 4 months. She thought about this sometimes. The version of herself that had been lying on the gravel beside the track in the October dark, bleeding from the forehead and trying to decide if her knee was broken. That person had been going to Edmonton because she had no better idea. She had not been going toward anything. She had been going away. This was different. She sat at the table one evening, writing in the notebook. The elk had been back, Morton, standing in the clearing at dusk, as if he were waiting for something. And she wanted to get it down right. And Cotter came in from the barn and stood at the basin, washing his hands, and she did not look up from the page, because she was in the middle of a sentence, and he did not say anything, because There was nothing he needed to say, and the stove ticked and the creek ran under its ice, and the lamp threw its small, steady circle, and she thought, this is what it feels like. Not happiness exactly. Or not only that, something more durable, like a good joint in a piece of wood, not pretty but right, holding properly, built to last the season. She finished her sentence. March came on hard, then suddenly soft. The first real thaw came in the 3rd week. She felt it before she heard it. A change in the air pressure, a smell like something underground releasing. By the end of the week the creek was loud again, and the snow on the south face of the clearing was pulling back from the base of the pines. There was still time to leave. The trail to the rail line would be passable in another few weeks. She had money. Cotter had given her for the nursing. He'd started this in November, matter-of-factly, folding bills and leaving them on the table, and when she'd started to object he'd said, a person should be paid for what they're worth, and that had been the end of that. She had enough. She could get to Edmonton. She could get anywhere. She thought about it, the way she thought about the weather, practically, accounting for conditions. On the last day of March, a man came up the trail on a spotted horse. He was from the outfitter in the valley, and he'd come about the summer guiding season. He sat in the cabin and talked to Cotter about the season, and Neva made tea and stayed mostly quiet, but the man, Keswick, he was called, a compact man, with a red beard and the permanently squinted eyes of someone who spends most of his time in bright open country, looked at her with the frank assessing look of a man trying to figure out a situation. On his way out he said, to both of them, or maybe to neither, good setup you've got up here. After he left, the cabin held the silence that follows a stranger's departure. Cotter stood at the table. He had the look he sometimes got, thought behind his face, working something toward the surface. The guiding season, he said. Yes, I'll be gone patches of the summer. 2, 3 weeks at a time sometimes. All right. He picked up his cup and set it down again. You don't have to stay for that part. I know, she said. He waited. She looked at the shelf where the small carved animals stood, a bear, a hare, a mule that was unmistakably the mule in the barn, rendered in a few quick strokes of a knife, better than it had any right to be. He'd added a bird she hadn't noticed before, a jay with its wings half open. I'll plant the kitchen garden, she said, before you go, and I'll want a list of what Theo needs watching for. I'll go to Jasper more often while you're on the trail. He was very still. The southeast corner gets the most sun, he said finally. For the garden. I thought so, she said. She picked up her cup. Outside, the creek was loud with snowmelt, running fast over the rocks, and the light was coming through the east window at the long morning angle it got in spring, and somewhere in the pines a whiskey jack was making its ungainly racket, and the mountain held them the way mountains hold things. Without ceremony, just the simple and total fact of it. She drank her tea. The season was beginning.